Pour écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour.
Habari za leo.
On behalf of ICLEI Africa, the Africa Center for Cities, Our Future Cities,
Surge Africa and the Red Cross Crescent Climate Center,
We are delighted to welcome you to the Rise Africa 2023 Action Festival.
Rise Africa is a platform that brings together thinkers, doers, and enablers
to inspire action for sustainable cities.
This is the third edition of our virtual festival.
it brings together insights, practices, and visions from across the continent.
This year's theme is The Cities We Want.
the cities we want.
the cities we want.
The cities we want.
This mirrors the African Union 2063 Agenda Vision, the Africa we want.
It is a wonderful Pan-African call for transformative change.
However, the agenda does not adequately embrace urbanization as a potential positive force for improving prosperity, inclusivity, and environmental well-being on the continent.
We need more emphasis on the role of cities and local action. And this festival aims to provide inputs into this agenda.
The cities we have are
Expanding,
incomplete,
inventive,
contested.
facing impending crisis, yet brimming with potential.
The cities we want are
people-centered,
Safe and healthy.
beacons of culture,
unflinchingly modern.
And adapting to change and leading global innovation.
We'll make these cities through
Experimenting,
learning
collaborating,
and amplifying the everyday actions of people who are shaping their cities.
The festival invites you to embrace different ways of knowing,
It invites you to forge new partnerships,
Experiment with new concepts and ideas.
to seek ways to bridge science, business, policy, and the arts.
Together, let's enter this space in the spirit of poetic possibilities.
The cities I want, I already have. In people, all of us children, mommy's sons and daddy's daughters, not raised ideally, but we're still proper. Carrying dust of townships on our skins, unwashable identities and unsolvable complexes, crisscrossing each other with dance, loving where hatred has tried, succeeding where governments have failed. I see monuments in these lives standing here, deities to be worshipped after now, each one gods in their own rights, kings and queens of the yellow and black. We live here together, synchronized dreamers in a city that never sleeps. If there is still one person left grinding on the streets, when you write about a place like Lagos, you do not convolute the language. Come meet us where joy has found us, on the streets where art has found voice, in dance theaters raised on canals, and open mics staged on wooden bridges. I found my cities here, in the people, full of life, each one a road rager, each one a mouthful of curses, each one a mouthful of blessings, each one a hand full of blessings, because that's how it ought to be.
Good afternoon, all of you gathered for this Rise Africa conference. I love the theme, Rise Africa, because that is my heartbeat. Every morning when I wake up, I'm thinking, how can I help the rise of my continent? How can I help the rise of the people of Africa? It's really something that means it gives me the reason to get up and get going every day. So I want to congratulate all of you for gathering around this theme, for thinking of more ways that we can contribute to the rise of the African continent. I also want to applaud the organizers. I'll just take a moment to thank in particular Nasreen Alamin, my sister, who invited me to participate in this, and also Luca, who helped to organize all my participation, especially because I was having some technical challenges. So what I want to talk about is my other big passion, which is outside, when I'm not thinking about Africa, I'm thinking about women. And today I want to talk about the cities we want from the lens of the African woman. I want to reflect on this theme, looking at 3 areas: commitments, contribution, and connection. First, let me tell you a personal story. I was born and raised in one of Africa's megacities in the West African coast in Lagos, Nigeria. I was raised in a part of the city called Ikeja, which is the seat of government. But when I was growing up, it was also quite a simple, quiet place. And without traffic, to get to my school from my home, my school was in Yaba, was maybe 20 minutes. But maybe on a Sunday or on a Saturday, or if you're lucky, on non-peak hours, you could do that. In general, it usually would take an hour if we were lucky. If we made the mistake of leaving the house with a 10-minute delay, it could add another half hour for us to get to school, and we would arrive late, which was very stressful when we were growing up. But living in Ikeja, which is one of the more affluent parts of Lagos, we were already quite privileged trying to get to Yaba. There are people who live not so very far, but maybe because there are not enough good roads that connect, their commute one way could be 3 hours, 4 hours in that megacity. And when I was growing up, I had asthma. Luckily for me, down the road was in the beginning of the street in which I lived was a clinic. So whenever I'd have an asthma attack, sometimes my mom would walk me, other times a sibling would walk me, and we would just walk 2 minutes to the clinic. Then they'd administer this injection, and me struggling to breathe, they would administer the injection. It would take a very long time. It was a steroid. It would take maybe 5-10 minutes. And by the end, I would be breathing normally and I would be able to go home and sleep. I think also of my mom, who had an office in Okpebi. Okpebi is just one street away from Toyin Street, in which I lived. And to get home with traffic, maybe it would take her 20-30 minutes. It was just down the road. So it didn't take that long. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the commitments women have. Really, women in Africa have very gendered lives. They have the role of the very traditional roles, for the most part, of the family. They're responsible for these. They're responsible for the care of children. They're responsible for the care of their husband and even extended family. And many of them are entrepreneurs, like my mother was. And trying to juggle all these commitments can just take up so much of their time. And it's one of the reasons why the women on the continent are so time poor. Then I also think of contributions. You know, when my father, who was a very successful businessman in Lagos, decided that he was going to run for office, he was going to run for president in Nigeria, he went ahead and ran, and luckily for him, or maybe not so lucky for him, he won. And he was, but then the army that governed at that time didn't want to actually complete the transition to a democratic system. So after negotiating with him for a while, they put him in jail, which left a pro-democracy movement without their leader. And it was at this time that my mother decided that she wanted to contribute to help advance Nigeria's effort to secure a democratic system. And so she set aside her business, she set aside her mothering duties, and focused on building this movement, going to marches, speaking before the thousands of protesters, organizing market women to go on strike, organizing the oil workers union to go on strike. She would speak to CNN, BBC, Voice of America, local media within Nigeria, continental media, to give voice to the demands of Nigerian people for democracy. And she was doing all of this within the city of Lagos, but also sometimes she would have to go far, to drive hours into other states to organize people. Contributions are what will make African women able to transform the landscape of our continent. Because of my mother's contribution and others like her, so many others who were involved in students' unions, who were involved as journalists, who were workers, who were in the markets, who were just lay citizens, farmers, what have you, all of them coming together to demand a democratic system. In 1999, 3 years after my father, 4 years actually, my father won an election in 93. And 6 years after that, in 1999, because of this movement that was built, Nigeria was able to restore democratic rule, and the Nigerian army was able to return to the barracks. Then I want to talk about connection. The whole world is connected in just ways that are so powerful and sometimes hard for us to see. You know, Africa trades with the world. Here in front of me, I have my cell phone. To make this cell phone, you need coltan, and the coltan that they use to make it, they get from Congo. Congo has supplied much of the world's coltan that has produced over billions, tens of billions of cell phones. Many African countries are in the forefront with their raw materials contributing to many of the technologies that we see in the world. And in fact, now that we're at the cusp of a green energy revolution, Africa again is in demand. Zimbabwe for lithium, Nigeria also for lithium, and green hydrogen from Namibia. You cannot conceive of this climate, of humanity responding to the climate challenge, humanity developing green technologies without the connection to the continent of Africa. And yet, you know, there was a recent study that said that the world's wealth now has reached a level of $1 trillion. And within that $1 trillion, with all Africa has contributed over centuries to the modern global economy, you would think that we would have a significant share. But Africa's share in nominal terms is not but 2.8%. In purchasing power parity terms, in terms of the local currencies, it's about 4.5%. It's minuscule when you consider the fact that the African population relative to the global population is about 18%. And this lived reality, this lack of proper connection between Africa's economies and the world in which we live translates into the ghettos and that we have all over the continent, and the fact that we have so many young people without employment, so many young people without the skills to even work, and even that we have states that have huge populations or even sometimes small populations, but rarely do they have the resources to educate them properly, to provide healthcare properly, to provide infrastructure for them so that they can live decent lives. Mrs. Zuma charged us in the letter that she wrote for Rise Africa. She's charged us to really center our own vision for African cities around our own understanding, our own values, our own culture. What the world knows about African culture is well captured by the South African word Ubuntu, which is about our shared humanity. Africans are a communal people. When you talk about Europeans or Americans, you talk about individualistic cultures. Africa is the opposite of this. We're communal oriented. We think not just of ourselves, but of our families, and not even just of the narrow family of father, mother, and children, but extended families. Indeed, in rural Africa, many families live in compounds all together. How do we bring this understanding of our shared humanity to how we shape the cities in Africa? How do we allow it to help us construct cities where African women can express, their connections, their contributions, their commitments, and can really serve their commitments in a way that is not going to leave them drained, and really so that they can reach their full potential? It's an important question because according to McKinsey, if African women were able to be on equal terms with men in their expression in the economy, in their participation in the economy, Africa's GDP would increase by 10%. It's incredible. And also, we also know from all the analysis from studies, so many studies that have been done, that when women participate in governance, in the political arena, the governments spend more of public resources on healthcare, on education, on infrastructure, public services. So we need to find a way to answer this question so that African women can participate. And we need to recruit men to help us in this, and stop thinking and acting as if when we ask for women's empowerment, it's only going to work for the women. Because when we empower the women, in the end, it works for everybody. The reality of my childhood when I was growing up was that it was highly privileged, that the clinic was just down the road, that the school was not so very far, even though for me, an hour is a lot. But within Lagos, it was actually reasonable, that my mom was able to walk just 20 minutes from our home. All of that is privilege. And the problem, and it points to the fundamental problem with African cities, we design Africa's cities for the elite, for a very small fraction of the total population. And we need to turn that upside down. Cities should be designed for the majority of people, and especially for the most vulnerable people. And if cities are so designed, everybody will benefit, including the small minority that has a lot of resources. It is wrong to design cities for the strongest and leave the weakest and the vulnerable where they are and to find their own way. There's nothing about that that speaks of Ubuntu. It is un-African. Perhaps it's something that we inherited from the colonial time. But if we want to build the cities we want, if we want to build the Africa that we want, then it's time that we center our own values we should put our values in the center of all decision making and build from there. So in concluding my remarks today, I want to say that Africa still has so much to contribute to the world. We're in the beginning now of a new world. There's so many changes that are happening that are opening new opportunities, because what we think of as a climate crisis is really a climate opportunity to transform the way in which we do things. So we're going to be moving away step by step from globalization, shipping things from very far places to African cities. We will be looking more at localization, because we as a world community will see that it doesn't make sense to spend all that fuel shipping from great distances when Africa has people who can work and can produce these things more proximately to the consumer. And so all of this, the climate crisis is going to open up these new opportunities for us. But we must make sure that as it opens up the opportunities, we're not just thinking of how men advance. Africa cannot go forward with while women are being left behind. Women have a role to play. I've seen it. My mom contributed to our democratic struggle. I contributed to my country's democratic struggle. She contributed to the economy. I contribute to the economy. You know, through my organization, Women in Africa, we train 9,000 women across the African continent in every country every year. And we're able to help them to contribute to the economy. But we are not, we're just one actor. We all must work together, men and women, to build an Africa that supports Africa's women. And if we do so, then one day, and maybe not too long from now, the whole world will be looking and saying that they want to come to Africa, they want to work, the world's people will say they want to work in Africa, they want to live in Africa, because what Africa will have is that Ubuntu spirit, but it will be translated in our economy, it will be translated in the culture, it will be translated in the politics, and we'll be showing the world, you know, not just the Africa we want, but what the world could be. So thank you for the efforts that you're making through Rise Africa, and I hope that your deliberations over the next days are such that we get to this destination even sooner. Thank you.
Yeah, so my name is Emily Wanja, and I have a background in producing and also impact producing. Actually, I am an impact producer still, and I currently work with the team at Doc Society, Climate Story Unit, as the Global Community Manager. And I'm also involved in most of the programs that we have happening on the continent of Africa with our cultural allies and partners, which is just a joy to get to work with them every day. I am based in Nairobi, Kenya. And yeah, I'm very excited to participate in this conversation. I think for a long, it's really important to think of cultural work as a work of collaboration and partnerships and learning and also unlearning because it's narrative work. And I like to think of us working together towards a shift in narrative and towards a cultural intervention that requires us to start seeing ourselves and in the way we speak about ourselves and in the stories that we tell from a point of joy, from a point of power, from a point of a deep understanding of who we are, our values, and our vibrant culture. It's very important because for a long time, obviously, there have been harmful narratives that have gone on and have been perpetuated about the continent, about us and our experiences as Africans. And so being able to capture our experiences and our realities is so important, both on a continental level, because it helps us understand each other more. It helps strengthen our bond, you know, as Africans, as practitioners, you know, as storytellers as well. It helps collaboration and in sharing of whatever available resources are there. And also helps in growth because we can learn a lot from one another. And we will be learning from a point of contexts that are almost similar in challenges, sometimes even similar in opportunities, and just tapping on talent from across the continent. And that's exciting. And it's beautiful when you get into a room that's full of storytellers from Africa or who are passionate about these kinds of narrative on the continent. and you're all like buzzing with ideas and innovations and how everyone is collaborating, even with other stakeholders that are not necessarily storytellers. And that's what I'm about, just about innovation, about forward thinking, being really optimistic and capitalizing and owning and spearheading the opportunities that exist, and also just discovering other opportunities that might not exist. Yeah. Mainly, especially in the recent years, have been involved in climate storytelling. And in climate storytelling has been important to think about our entry point and the kind of narratives we support. And most of them are really narratives and stories that have climate justice at their core. And I understand, and we completely understand, that climate challenges and this issue of climate justice may reflect differently in different regions. And so for the work that we've been doing on the continent, especially, the main question has been, what is the climate justice narrative for Africa? How does it manifest itself? And how shall we communicate about this narrative? And it's complete recognition that as storytellers, we may not have all the answers. And so it calls for partnerships and collaboration with other stakeholders, be it from academia, policy, civil society, people who've been doing this work for a very long time, and people who understand that policy and science is important, but it's not enough to create that cultural shift that's needed and the action that needs to be driven among the public. And this is where the power of storytelling then comes in. It's the ability of storytelling to compel populations and members of the public to action by understanding the challenges, but also the opportunities that exist in their lives as far as climate challenges are concerned. And so this is some of the narrative shift work that we are doing on the continent, again, in partnership with different allies and cultural organizations across the continent. Yeah. I think the question of platforms, again, varies depending on which region you're in. And depending on the challenges that you experience every day. I'm going to give you an example. For example, we know that on the continent, we have over 600 million people who do not have access to electricity, right? And that already presents a challenge in the form of access to technology, to infrastructure, for example, and just tools of storytelling, even if it's a smartphone, because it will need to be charged later. Even things like cameras, because they use batteries, which later need to be charged. And so that already is a challenge in itself. And I don't want to start by getting onto the challenges, but it's important to just mention a few, just to kind of paint a picture of maybe where we're coming from as far as platforms are concerned. The issue of access to technology and infrastructure obviously goes hand in hand with access to resources as well. And so funding is restrictive because we do not have, in most African countries, we do not have cultural funds that are supported by the government to support artists and storytellers. And so most colleagues obviously have to really hustle and look for international funds that allow or that they can be eligible to support work within the continent. Other challenges that go hand in hand with platform are lack of visibility as well and exposure. And this is when you think especially about our colleagues who do not necessarily live near cities, right? They struggle with where their work is going to be seen. And this affects also their opportunities to collaborate, to meet, for partnerships, for example, to access even funding, for instance, and also audience reach for their content. And then there's also things like cultural biases, isn't it? Obviously, there's biases and stereotypes that have existed for a long time as far as African storytelling is concerned. And it's taken a long time to change that perception, and it's not something that we can stop today. It's something that has to be our lifestyle, something that we do constantly to change how we are viewed and our narrative. So these are some of the challenges that go hand in hand with platform, because then it's which platform is available for you as a storyteller, whichever part of the continent you're in, right? This is not to say though that there are no opportunities, because with challenges comes opportunities as well. This then gives us an opportunity to understand that if not one person has got all this, an environment that accords them all these resources or these opportunities, then we are forced to collaborate, and then collaboration becomes very important. For a long time, obviously, it has appeared as if, storytelling and storytellers along in the continent are siloed, or really it's a field that can look like it's very fragmented. And so collaboration and formation of communities like storytelling communities becomes very important in sharing the resources that are available, in enriching the quality of our work, in enriching the discourse and the impact that our storytelling work goes on to have. It's capitalizing on whatever resources or meeting places, arenas that are available. And this speaks directly to, for example, the non-existence of a box office system on the continent, for example, and theaters as well. But in the absence of all of that, we do have a lot of places where people convene, right? There's social halls, for example. There is even church halls, for example, in the afternoon that exist, and people convene in such places to watch things or to watch theater performances. So these challenges bring about us looking within and seeing what opportunities are actually there that we can capitalize on to exhibit and to get our work seen by as many people as possible. I think platforms are important. We must think about them because it's a question of access. And I like to always say that one of the biggest problems we have as storytellers on the continent is access. So there's access to resources, information. Even when you think about our communities, for example, and even in the discourse of a topic like climate change, for instance, access to leadership, access to policy making, for example, venues or our communities to contribute meaningfully towards policy work that's going to affect their lives, access where our communities, for example, can share their lived experiences to inform decisions that are being made concerning their lives, right? And concerning resource allocation, for instance, on the national or even sometimes county level. And so the question of access is always very big for me, right? And so then we must think about platforms, what platforms are available, and then how do we capitalize on them? When you think about, for example, mobile phone and smartphone penetration in Africa, that's a big deal. When you think about community radios, for instance, for a lot of our communities, that's a big deal. How can we continue to create storytelling that is compelling, that is great quality, that is real and that resonates with these audiences, so we can reach them, right? So I believe we need to constantly interrogate what are the ways in which we must reach everyone to the last mile. And then platform is one. The second one is the content itself. What are we actually saying? What perspective are we sharing? How do we understand ourselves? What's the message we are putting out there? And then the question of the narrative shift then comes in. Who are we as a people? What are our values? What's the place of ancestral knowledge, for example, and lived experiences in the work that we are doing? What's the place of our traditions, for example, oral tradition, which is a tradition of how we have communicated and how we learn things, how we absorb knowledge as Africans, for instance? What's the place of that? when we have all of this, technology, platforms and digital platforms and tools available for us, it's a good thing. And I think we need to find a way of using that so we retain our authenticity from a point of strength, right? And so in this whole conversation, it's so important as well to think about the impact. In terms of the storytelling work that we're doing and creating every day, what impact does it go on to have? And can we look back and say, this is what happened beyond the red carpet, beyond the glitz and the glamour, for instance, beyond the likes and the clicks and the views on the social media platforms? And it's possible to really plug into communities that are doing the impact work, for instance. And there are people called impact producers, for example, whose work it is to look at storytelling work and start working together with the filmmakers and the storytellers and other stakeholders, for example, involved in the issue area, to think about what would be the impact campaign of this film. In impact work, you're looking at the communities that are featured in the film or in the storytelling work. You're looking at the protagonist's life and thinking, how can this work of storytelling help towards creating social impact in their lives? And because of that, then it opens you it opens the storytelling team to a much wider community of collaborators, of partnerships in trying to create this social impact. And so I would say that we need to constantly think about what impact, excuse me, sorry, I just dropped my iPod. Take that again. And so we need to constantly think about what impact can this work go on and have in the lives of the communities that are represented in it. If there's a particular issue area that I'm talking about or my storytelling work touches on, how can I work with stakeholders involved in that issue area to drive or to move the needle in whatever discourse or debate that's happening around that story? And this is because there's no doubt on the power of storytelling to move people and to drive people into action. Yeah.
I'm very pleased to join the Rise Africa 2023 Action Festival. Colleagues, there is little doubt that it will be cities where most of our climate challenges will play out and where they ultimately will be won or lost, perhaps most especially in Africa. With the world's population expected to increase to 9 billion people by 2050, Africa will host more than half of that growth. Urban populations are expected to nearly triple to more than 1.3 billion, with many below the age of 35. Demographics like these can often influence how vulnerable cities are in the face of natural disasters, vulnerabilities that will significantly be impacted by climate change. Indeed, many African cities have already been at the epicenter of loss and damages caused by climate risks. And given our current climate trajectory, their frequency, their severity will undoubtedly increase. As a recent released World Bank report, Thriving, Making Cities Green, Resilient, and Inclusive in a Changing Climate State, if we are to meet the global target of net zero emissions by 2050, cities in lower income countries must develop differently from the historic emission trajectories of cities in higher income countries. Secondly, the report states that cities in low and lower middle income countries face the highest projected climate change related hazards. And thirdly, cities in low and lower middle income countries are less resilient to increasing frequent climate change related shocks and stresses. But demographics do not dictate destiny. As the most rapidly urbanizing region in the world, Africa presents a unique opportunity to urbanize right. In other words, an opportunity to move towards what their vision of a green, sustainable, resilient, and prosperous city should be. But let's be clear, there can be no single vision of any one city. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. We may share ideas, which of course is why we are here, but what works in Dakar may not always work in Gaborone. And certainly, when it comes to sharing, I urge cities to join the hundreds that have already publicly committed to climate action through the Race to Zero and Race to Resilience campaigns. It offers a unique opportunity to showcase local actions and brings together those who share our collective vision for a healthy planet. The singular vision that unites us all is to limit global temperature rise by 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of this century. Cities may find their own unique solutions to get there, but the point is to get there. Nations can have a clear framework for what they need to implement the Paris Agreement in all areas of mitigation, adaptation, capacity building, finance, and technologies transfer. But it's critical that cities and climate change approaches and actions are integrated into nationally determined contributions. NDC's updates are now required annually. In a similar vein, we encourage all nations to immediately develop and implement ambitious national adaptation plans that are inclusive and integrate city and community resilient plans. To that end, it is therefore of the highest importance that developed countries, I repeat, stand by their promise to double finance for adaptation from 2019 levels of 2025 as expressed in the Glasgow Climate Pact. And it's also vital that access to this finance, including to international funding mechanisms, is simplified. Here again, I would like to point out the several decisions at COP26 and COP27 calling on international funding institutions and multilateral development banks to enhance the mobilization of financial support to developing countries and economies in transition, as well as to increase its scale and effectiveness. Regarding outstanding pledges, developed countries themselves have acknowledged their failure to meet their long-standing commitments to mobilize the 100 billion annually for climate action in developing nations. This is a central element to build trust in multilateralism, in our collective efforts to address climate change and for future climate action. We cannot expect to maintain trust in future commitments if current ones have not yet been met. The establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund was for many the highlight of the United Nations Climate Conference, COP27, and the culmination of decades of pressure from climate vulnerable developing countries. This fund aims to provide financial assistance to nations most vulnerable and impacted by the effects of climate change. As the climate crisis intensifies, adapting to its fallout is key. While the historic discussions and decisions were welcomed, this is but the first step, and success will depend on how quickly these funds get off the ground. Representatives from 24 countries are meeting as the transitional committee, and they've already begun their work to decide what form the fund should take, which countries should contribute, and where and how the money should be distributed. The African continent, for example, contributes the least to climate change, yet it's the most vulnerable to its impacts. African countries that contribute so little will have to spend up to 5 times more on adapting to climate crisis than on healthcare. G20 countries, on the other hand, represent around 75% of global emissions, greenhouse emissions. But meanwhile, a country like Pakistan has seen $30 billion in damages from severe flooding, but emits less than 1% of global emissions. Colleagues and friends, with COP28 fast approaching, Despite this being a year of significant economic and political challenges throughout the world, we cannot forget that climate change is the global emergency that rises above all others. It is our existential crisis. We cannot afford any delay in acting upon it. We particularly need to progress in the remaining 6 months of this year in addressing very significant issues related to finance, mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and just transitions. If we are to address climate change and build stronger cities in Africa and throughout the world, we must do the work necessary. A key feature at COP28 will be the first global stocktake. Every 5 years, a global stocktake will occur to assess the collective progress of all parties to the global targets of the Paris Agreement, with the first one taking place in 2023 in Dubai. It will be very important that the global stocktake shows evidence that the global assessment of the implementation of the essential elements of climate change under the Paris Agreement are carried out, and specifically to show how subnational governments are implementing the climate action, but also show their funding challenges and their various needs ongoing forward to effectively, efficiently, and inclusively address climate change, adaptation, and mitigation challenges. Additionally, the global stocktake will showcase the best practices and innovations of cities. I look forward to working with all of you to achieve that success, build stronger, greener, and more resilient cities in Africa, and to ensure a just and prosperous and thriving future for all people in Africa and in the world. Rise, Africa, rise. Thank you.